When President Biden outlines his $1.8 trillion American Families Plan, he's going to make it clear that he's betting that an investment in childcare will spur long-term economic growth. The plan will include universal pre-K, guaranteed paid family and medical leave, and an extension of the expanded child tax credit. So how will Biden's plan support an increased return to the workforce for working parents? Bloomberg U.S. economic reporter Olivia Rockman and Bloomberg opinion senior columnist Tim O'Brien join me now for more. Olivia, Tim, thanks so much for being here. It's great to see both of you. Olivia, I want to start with you because you've been digging into what is expected to be announced today. How is this plan going to get more parents back into the workforce?
We know that before the pandemic and even during the pandemic, women's and men's labor force participation is really held back by childcare obligations. And so expanding childcare, expanding paid leave, having financial incentives through tax credits is really a way to incentivize parents to jump into the labor force if they weren't able to already.
And Olivia, about half of Americans live in childcare deserts. How specifically does the $1.8 trillion help that? What does it do?
So there's funding in the bill to increase dollars for childcare centers themselves, which would ideally allow them to build more and also to get more workers into the labor force to provide this care.
Hey, Tim, come on in here and talk a little bit about the way that the Biden administration is planning to pay for this. Taxing the wealthiest Americans. Last week, when Bloomberg News broke the story about some of the changes that the Biden administration is proposing, the stock market took a little bit of a dive, but recovered significantly. Yet the wealthiest Americans are really upset about this. Explain why they shouldn't necessarily be.
They're in anger, denial, and grief, according to our Bloomberg News colleagues, Tim. Look, people shouldn't be penalized for investment success. People shouldn't be penalized for hard work. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of mythology out there about the impact of things like the capital gains tax. It does not reduce government revenue. It does not force massive and permanent sell-offs in stocks and other assets. And it does not slow the engine of the economy. Remember, we've had 3 capital gains increases between 1987 and the present, and the stock market has been on a massive bull run over that time. So those did not derail growth. I think what has to be focused on here is matching the ambition of Biden's proposals, which I think are necessary to support working Americans and the middle class, against a rational way to fund them. And the wealthiest Americans have enjoyed 40 years of unusual prosperity. There is a wide and yawning chasm around income inequality, and it makes sense to target tax funding on the corporate and the personal side around those companies and individuals who can most afford it.
Olivia, come on in here, because Tim makes the great point that the middle class in the U.S. has absolutely been hollowed out over the last 40 years. The chasm between the haves and have-nots have gotten bigger. How does the American Families Plan try to address that, and also take a step back and just give us some numbers on what it actually looks like for Americans with kids who are trying to get by?
Yeah, so from the income inequality gap, some of the proposals in there are on a sliding scale. So it would cover childcare completely for lower income families, whereas it would support it or subsidize it for middle income families, and then high income families would still pay themselves. So there are kind of proposals to stagger it in that way. In terms of the middle class affording, childcare in general and lower income families, we've seen some studies that show that most families pay up to 25% of their income on childcare, and so Biden's goal is to make it 7% or less for American families.
And the idea with that, Olivia, is that it would provide an incentive for people to re-enter the workforce who don't find that it's actually worth doing in an environment where childcare is so expensive, right?
That's exactly right.
So take us through how exactly that would work and the mechanics of this, because I think that when there is a plan this big and this complicated, there is some trouble visualizing what exactly it would look like for families.
Right. So the idea is that by subsidizing care and by providing additional funding for families, they would say, oh, that's affordable. Okay, I'll go back to work now and support my family in this other way. Versus now, maybe it's, one parent is working and making an income, and typically the mother is staying home and taking care of the children because they don't want to front that cost.
Tim, isn't there just a really strong argument for America to have a really solid middle class, wouldn't the wealthiest Americans find that that's actually good for global stock prices if the purchasing power of Americans goes up, if a rising tide lifts all ships?
Yes, yes, and yes. And I don't think that's a matter of opinion, Tim. Historically, it's in the data. The key over the last century to American prosperity has been the growth and opportunities realized by a broad, affluent, middle-class consumer base. And it does not suit us well to have a narrow range at the top where most people enjoy the spoils of the economy and everyone else is struggling. There's all sorts of negative fallout around that. So yes, of course that matters. And I think a lot of the programs that Biden is targeting are very necessary. And there's a track record there. Head Start has been one of the most successful public investment programs around. It has created an educated, stable population among kids who might otherwise be lost in the shuffle. And I think Biden's effort here is to actually put a lot of fiscal and policy muscle behind that. You know, affluent families know how important daycare is because they can afford it.
Yeah.
Affluent partners can often afford daycare or a nanny, so both people in the relationship can work. That is out of the reach of most middle class people and almost all working class people. And these kind of measures will go a long way towards addressing that.
Tim, before we get to the politics of this, I just want you to briefly explain carried interest and to what extent it has really benefited the wealthiest Americans and what potentially closing that loophole would do. Because I think if there were a lot more attention around the way that carried interest is treated taxably, then, or from a tax perspective, then I think that there would be widespread calls for this loophole to be closed.
Well, and in fact, Donald Trump called for it early in his presidency, but never addressed it. Biden is calling for it again now. Carried interest is essentially a perk open to hedge fund managers, private equity managers, other investors who treat the income they earn each year as a capital gain rather than personal income tax, as personal income, which means then they pay a much lower rate on it. They pay the capital gains rate, essentially, rather than the personal income tax rate. So you have this perverse phenomenon where the most affluent members of our society are paying some of the lowest personal income tax rates. And it would go a long way towards shoring up equity around how income is treated in the tax code.
So let's talk politics of this, Olivia. A proposal is one thing. Goals are one thing. Campaigning on these promises is one thing. Getting this through Congress, especially with the makeup of Congress as it is, and ahead of the midterm elections, is an entirely different thing. Thinking forward, what does it look like when it actually comes to fruition?
So we know that there is bipartisan support around childcare and around funding for this. However, the way it's funded, as was mentioned earlier, is hugely controversial.
Yeah.
We even heard last week in a Ways and Means committee hearing that some Republicans, while they support this, are also concerned that any sort of taxes would impact the middle class and therefore counteract the effects of childcare. And so it is likely to face pretty hefty debate in Congress.
Tim O'Brien, your prediction for how or if it gets through. How do the Democrats pull it off?
They're going to have to get some Republicans on their side, because they have a very narrow majority in the House and it's even Steven in the Senate. So there's going to have to be some horse trading. I think there's a lot in these proposals that Republicans want. I think the Biden White House has been doing a lot of outreach to Republicans to gauge both their temperature and their counter proposals around this package. I don't think there's any doubt that corporate and personal income taxes are going to increase. I don't think there's any doubt that a meaningful portion of what Biden has on the table will get funded. I think the real, turf war will be around what the actual numbers are.
So Tim, if you're a Democrat, if you're President Biden, if you're an advisor to President Biden, what's a realistic way to think about how you get Republicans on board if raising taxes is anathema?
Well, they're going to. I think you have to appeal to voters as always, and you have to really convey in clear, colloquial, relatable messages how these policies improve people's lives. That is where political wars are won and lost. That's where policy becomes real for people. Biden has to get into these communities, and they've done a lot of this already. I think they've done it. This White House has done a pretty good job, a very good job, in fact, of selling their policies thus far. They poll well. He's getting good responses from the electorate around these things, and I have to continue in that vein. And they have to move quickly, because I think there's a likelihood next year by the midterms you could see a real change in the composition of the Congress.
Yeah, Olivia, weigh in on that, because even though we just got done with the election of 2020, and we're 100 days into President Biden's presidency here, midterms are on the horizon. What does your reporting tell you about the way that Americans think about these policies, and if they're willing to support politicians who aren't necessarily in their own party, who do support policies such as these?
We saw with the American Jobs Plan, which was the first half of the infrastructure plan released a couple of weeks ago, that the approval rating is above 60% among both Democrats and Republicans, which is pretty strong support for, Democratic legislation. We're kind of waiting to see what the American Families Plan approval ratings will look like. But it seems like if, as was said, we can get support around this from both sides, that maybe people in Congress will actually be willing to pass it.
And look, it does seem, Tim, that President Biden learned from what happened in the wake of Obamacare, right? In the wake of the Affordable Care Act. And this was covered in the cover story of Bloomberg Business Week this week, that he didn't take a victory lap. He was modest about it. And President Biden learned from President Obama that you need to get out to the American people and actually communicate this. Is Biden doing a good job of that right now?
I think Biden needs to be out in the world personally more. I think he could do more personal salesmanship. But I do think I think there are two lessons Biden learned from his tenure in the Obama White House, and you pointed to one of them, which is don't gloat. But the other thing is don't be naive. Right. And you saw it around TARP and some other policies where I think the Obama White House initially went to Republicans with a sort of kumbaya perspective, and the Republicans turned around and ripped their faces off. And I think Biden has come into his White House now with those hard-learned lessons that there's got to be some real trench warfare around these policies if you want to get them through. Otherwise, you're going to get taken to the cleaners. Yeah, the clock is ticking, too, because those midterms are fast approaching. Bloomberg's Olivia Rockman and Tim O'Brien, a big thank you to both of you for your time on this. We'll, of course, be watching the president's speech closely tonight, and we'll bring it to you live, Bloomberg TV as well.
Hey, thanks for watching Bloomberg Quicktake Now. Subscribe to our channel to see the biggest stories the moment they happen from around the world. And tune in to our 24/7 live stream for global news coverage, documentaries, interviews, deep dives, and shows on the stories that you care most about.